Hare Om Namaha Om Harir Vidathyan Mama Sarvarakshang Nyastangri Padmaha Padagendra Prishte Durari Chamasi Gadeshi Chapa Pashanthano Ashtagano Ashtabahu Om Purpuva Svaha Tut Saviturvarenyam Pagodavasya Thimahi Theo Yonaha Prachodayat Om Hrang Hring Hrung Om Namo Bhagavate Rishikeshaya. In order to take advantage of the opportunity of this rare form of human life, it is incumbent upon every transcendentalist to spiritually evolve. His or her center of gravity should be engaged in conscious evolution and interested in the same development for the culture at large. As far as individual spiritual advancement is concerned, the proximate goal is to be moored in the timeless ground of enlightened awareness. This, of course, is the third tier of integral consciousness, which has many levels within it, and all these levels constitute spiritual rejuvenation. Below this tier is the second tier, in which there is some ability to get past deficiency needs and to focus instead upon self-actualization needs. Although pluralistic togetherness, which is at the apex of the second tier, ultimately proves unworkable, it is nevertheless higher than any kind of third-tier pretension. You can say that second tier is spiritually embryonic in a sense, but the whole goal of second tier is to finally get a perspective on integral consciousness. And it's integral consciousness which all the great traditions have taught throughout history. But that does not mean that the organized religions of the world have been teaching the same thing. The great traditions versus the organized religions of the world generally don't act in the same way, nor do they have the same goals, especially in this age. Indeed, they are generally opposed to one another. In order to understand how and why this happens, we need to consider two important topics. One is provisionality, denoted by the English preposition if, and the other is eligibility, denoted by the Sanskrit term adhikar. In Canto 11 of the Bhagavad Purana, chapter 21, text 2, we find this translation: to act in accordance with one's adhikar is declared to be good, but to act different from one's eligibility is considered to be evil. This is how good and evil are to be ascertained. The analysis in today's discourse will continue for 3 more. In all, we shall proffer 28 examples where His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, used the preposition if in order to present a clear understanding that a provision had to be met in order for an outcome to be attained. Now, sometimes the provision was in the form of a warning, which meant that if the outcome was attained, it would be evil. At other times, the provision indicated an outcome compatible with integral consciousness with spiritual advancement, and the outcome would then be considered to be very good. In those cases, the devotee, in order to achieve that spiritual outcome, had to act in accord with his or her adhikar. Now, as mentioned in our previous discourse last month, in order to move up from the astral to the causal to the non-dual, a transcendentalist has to be profoundly interested in integral consciousness and in personal liberation. A human being who is in the first tier has no interest in mukti or liberation. Such an individual is ensconced by material desires which are selfish and egotistical. He identifies with those. He identifies with his sensual pleasures, and also he's absorbed in deficiency needs meeting those. Now, when a person who is in the first tier is considered to be guru, which is not possible, we have a very bad situation. When a first tier imitator pretends to be a fully liberated Diksha guru, we are once again forced to endure the obnoxious display of the relentless pseudo-spiritual narcissism that permeates the postmodern ego of this age. We need to go beyond that. And in order to get beyond that, we need to move up into the third tier. We at least need to move into a transpersonal witness stage. This stage is not necessarily impersonal. To be genuine, it must be consciously aware of the evolutionary impulse that is present in all individuals and which is also hidden but present within the core of the culture. Living transcendentally in accord with God's and nature's laws means actuating third-tier values. Holistic patterns of growth are required in order to eventually realize the supermind, which is Brahman realization beyond the coverings and beyond even cosmic consciousness, a realization rarely attained. But we can get there as long as we recognize the principle of provisionality and as long as we have knowledge of our own personal adhikar. So without further ado, let's play 28 If. In Prabhupada's translation and purports to the Bhagavad Purana, we find in Canto 5, Chapter 18, Text 9, His Divine Grace says, if the Krishna consciousness movement spreads all over the world, and if by the grace of Krishna everyone accepts it, the thinking of envious people will change. If, provisional. Has this transpired? Do we see that since the Krishna consciousness movement was very active in the late 60s and early to mid 70s, and then Prabhupada left in 1977, do we see that the envious thinking of people has changed? Or do we see the world has degraded and gotten worse? If the Krishna consciousness movement spreads, but what is spreading? It has to be the pure Krishna consciousness movement that spreads. Then the envious thinking of people will change, because they will see honest devotees who are not envious, who are simply looking for the benefit of all human beings, and for that matter, all living entities. And in order to give them the highest welfare benefit possible, such transcendentalists present integral consciousness in the form of its highest level, namely Krishna consciousness. But the key element here is that Prabhupada put it in the form of if. So this is the first of 28. We're going to have 27 more examples of this. And therefore you have to also consider, when you read these provisions and when you consider the provisionality that is intrinsic to them, you have to think, was the provision met? Well, do we see the outcome? If we don't see the outcome, the indication is strong that the provision was not met. This is basic logic, although Sahajis and their sentimental and fanatical followers don't like to recognize logic. So let's look at one of his letters here. This was a letter to one of his governing body commissioners in 1970. He says, so if our GBC members remain strong, strictly following the regulative principles, everything will be all right. Once again, has everything been all right since he departed? For that matter, was everything all right while he was still here in the mid and late 70s? Or could it be more accurately stated that everything has gone pretty much all wrong? So then, from there, what? If our GBC members follow the rules and regulations carefully and stay strong, well, if everything went wrong, then doesn't that strongly indicate that they did not remain strong? Which means they were not following the rules and regulations which His Divine Grace gave to not only all of His disciples, but in particular to the leaders who He had selected on the governing body commission. Remember, the GBC was formed in late July of 1970. This was a letter written to one of those original 12 governing body commissioners in September of 1970. So at that time, the GBC was still strong, but we're not talking a long duration of time since it was first formed. Just a few months, July, August, September. Well, is there any specific indication by Prabhupada that his leaders were not following very nicely, that they were deviating from the basic rules and regulations? In point of fact, there is. This is a book written by one of his personal attendants. His Divine Grace, when he traveled, always had a secretary who typed his letters and took dictation, etc., and did formal things like mailing letters. And then he had a personal attendant who took care of what could be considered his bodily needs. So this book was written by his personal attendant in the mid-70s, who was with him for a few years, actually. Here's the statement by that devotee. Now, Srila Prabhupada said things to me that I could not comprehend. It was very disturbing. These words cut through my heart. He mentioned it to me on 2 separate occasions during his illness, saying one of my disciples is simply waiting that, quote unquote, when will the old man die so that I can become guru? I could not believe what I was hearing. Then he sat up in bed and looking at me, he said, this illness is caused because 80% of the leaders are not following the rules and regulations. Rather specific, isn't it? That was in August of 1974. So it answers the question of September 1970 to one of his commissioners, the provisionality, if the GBC remains strong and follows the rules and regulations. 80% not doing that is not a good number, which means the GBC by August of 1974 was already weak. And we can see that it was a bad managing unit. It promoted gold-plated grifters who were basically Vaishyas going out and using change-up and other rip-off techniques in order simply to increase the revenue. The purity was not increased by that. The knowledge that the devotees got from that was very sparse at best. As many of you know, His Divine Grace did not want plainclothes Sankirtan, so-called Sankirtan. He did not want what became in the vernacular known as the pick to be done in plain clothes. But it was pushed by many of his GBCs because they saw the revenue they could get, which would increase the power that they had. And it would also increase the power that they had over those devotees, because those devotees would not be advancing in knowledge and detachment. They'd be advancing in dishonest techniques, which creates a dishonest mentality. So in other words, Prabhupada's saying here, I'm ill, in August of 74 to his personal attendant, I'm ill because they're desiring that I die so they can be guru. I'm ill because they're not following. So if they're like that, does not that indicate that they were quite envious? Sure it does. And if they were envious, then wouldn't it indicate that they'd want to engage everybody in the totem pole who's under them in a way that those people would not actually advance and thus become threats to their power? Of course. And that's what was going on. They got to the top of the turtle tank and they made sure all the other turtles stayed under. Although there'd be the Sankirtan newsletter, which glorified the big three pickers and their big totals of quote-unquote Lakshmi points. But really, if you looked at the Sankirtan newsletter, it glorified the governing body commissioner of the zone where that took place, and it glorified the president of the so-called Maha Temple where it took place. So let's continue. Okay. Here we have another provision, another if. This is September 72 to one of his former governing body commissioners, one of the original 12, but this man had decided he didn't want to stay on the governing body anymore and had become more or less not an important player anymore. So Prabhupada writes to him, "You may know it that I am eternally your guide, but if you don't accept me as your guide, what can I do? Unfortunately, if my disciples do not take my guidance, what can I do? By bad association it so happens, so I remain silent. I see the pricks of Maya. So eternally I want to remain your guide, provided you want to accept me." That's rather clear. In other words, it's not that an initiated disciple or a follower who's uninitiated can do anything and everything and have an attitude that he or she can do anything or everything and not accept the guidance, but still think, oh, my eternal guru, he will deliver me at the end. If you accept a guru, you must accept his guidance. If you accept his guidance, that means you accept what he says to do, and you do that to the best of your ability, and you accept what he says not to do, and you avoid those things, and you avoid that association. So Prabhupada says in this letter, in September 1972, which was just a few months after the first major deviation by the GBC, which we shall discuss in significant detail, threadbare, in a future discourse. But for now, note for a fact that Prabhupada appeared to have bailed out the movement from that major deviation, but there is still a burnt remnant of it left. And so he was saying, I see the pricks of Maya. This is not a good indicator for the spiritual status of his governing body. Oh, they can say sentimentally, and in April of 2012, I had one of the original 12 tell me, oh, Prabhupada loved his GBC. He loved all his disciples. And he particularly loved the disciples who followed. He particularly loved the disciples who did not deviate and change the philosophy. He particularly loved the disciples who acted according to their adhikar, because if you act according to your level of eligibility, your adhikar will gradually increase, because your knowledge will increase, your realization will increase, your spiritual power will increase, and your ability to do will increase, and your ability not to do will increase. Jnana Bala Kriya will increase if you act according to your adhikar. But if you jump up above it, these things will not increase. They will gradually deteriorate. And if you act below it, as is indicated in this letter, then at a certain point, Prabhupada is saying, I want to remain your guide, but you're not following me, so how can I do it? What can I do? I want to be your guide. Follow me and I shall remain your guide. But you can't act below the level that I brought you to. So let's move on here. All right, we have this long letter to a disciple who is his personal secretary. At this time, this disciple was not a sannyasi and was not his personal secretary, but was one of his leaders. This was at the very end of 1972. If you yourself remain always pure, then your preaching will have effect. As soon as there is a little impurity, the whole thing will deteriorate and go to hell. So we shall not like to take the credit in that case. Well, that's a pretty severe statement. The sentimentalists, they like to say, oh, you're being so harsh. If you repeat what Prabhupada says, that's not being harsh. That's called following the parampara. He said that if even a little impurity entered his movement, the movement would deteriorate, would change, as we talked about in our last discourse, like the apple, where you can no longer even recognize that it's an apple at a certain point due to putrefaction or deterioration. That is the way of pure spiritual movements. They are not internationally organized religions. Organized religions in this age are in the lower modes with the pretense of the mode of goodness covering them and their leaders. But those leaders are not actually in the Sattvaguna. Therefore, because the world as a whole is completely absorbed and identifies with the modes of passion and ignorance, especially thinking that the mode of passion is the really good thing to achieve passionate mentality and passionate results is the actual goal of human life, when in point of fact it most certainly is not, and it does not lead at all to integral consciousness. It does not lead to personal liberation whatsoever. You cannot escape samsara in the mode of passion. You can dovetail the mode of passion if that's your svabhava, but then your consciousness will be elevated by pleasing the parampara in your dovetail so that you realize integral consciousness. But in and of itself, if the motive is passionate, that can never produce liberation or mukti. But here he's saying to his personal servant that even a little impurity can deteriorate his movement and send the whole thing to hell. What does this mean? This means that the movement becomes degraded, converted, changed, transformed to such an extent that if you enter it thinking that you're entering an ashram, a shelter, you're not. You're entering into a dark hole which will suck you in to a very dark place. This letter continues with another provision, so let us take a look at that. I am praying simply that all of you, my advanced disciples, GBC men, sannyasis, temple officers, like that all of you will become sober-minded and feeling always very much responsible how the things will go on as I have given them. If you simply do as I am doing, not avoiding anything which may have to be done for pushing on Krishna's movement, remaining always stuck up very tightly to the footsteps of Rupa Goswami, then without doubt you will remain always fresh and enthusiastic for working very energetically on Krishna's behalf without any fall down. Well, this is loaded. But the key element here is he says, he names his sannyasis, his temple presidents, temple officers even, which means not just the president, his GBC men, his advanced disciples who are not any of these things. If you will all become sober-minded. Why didn't he say, if you will all remain sober-minded? He didn't say that. He says in the letter, and this is to one of his advanced disciples, as I say, this devotee became a sannyasi not long after this, and he became Prabhupada's personal secretary not long after this. If you will all become sober-minded, that's called thira. Now, thira is certainly a stage of integral consciousness. There's no doubt about that. It's difficult to attain, but it can be attained even by Mayavadis and even by Buddhists. Thira, undisturbed. But he's not saying to stay sober-minded. He's saying that if all of you will become sober-minded. Again, it's an if. That if all of you, my advanced disciples, will become sober-minded, if you simply do as I am doing. Well, did they do that? What's the track record? What's the results? Did they become thira? Or instead did the whole thing become an overlordship arrangement, where instead of teaching those who weren't as advanced as you and giving seva opportunities so that the devotees could become as advanced and perhaps even pass you in advancement, they instead locked up their positions and in a not sober-minded way kept everybody down, engaged them in money collection predominantly. And also another thing about the sannyasis. In order to get the power, so many of these misleaders who were put on Prabhupada's initial governing body commission in 1970, there were no sannyasis at that time. Now, there were sannyasis, but they weren't on the GBC, the governing body commission. They were meant to go out and preach and make disciples, not for themselves, because Prabhupada was still present, physically manifest, so you bring the disciple to the guru, but in this way become trained up so that you can become guru, receive the order, which Prabhupada indicated in letters in 1975 that he was willing to give the order while he was still physically manifest. He never gave it because nobody was qualified. Adhikar. No one was near that standard. Instead, by engaging in the tapasya of the program, they built up their bala and then misused their bala or personal power in order to overlord situations. And since the power was diffused to the GBC, which the original 12 GBC, 11 of them were householders, 1 was a brahmachari. There's no sannyasis. He wanted the sannyasis separate. But by 1972, 1973, 1974, They're virtually all sannyasis now because they want to be both GBC and sannyas for the dual power. And then what happens? Oh, then somebody prematurely takes sannyas and he starts to get sentimental about his former wife, and then one of them opens the Pandora's box and says to Prabhupada, I'm going back to my wife. Prabhupada writes and says, no, you can't do that. The devotee says, I'm doing it anyway. The GBC, sannyasi so-called. And the whole Pandora's box opens up, and we could go on and on what that led to. But the point here is that Prabhupada, as he gave this provisionality of this particular excerpt from this letter, he divides his temple officers, virtually all of whom at that time, not all, but virtually all of whom were householders, his GBC and his sannyasis. He mentions these things separately. But he says, if you will all become, we need to see the perspective there. We need to see what the words mean. It's rather obvious. So let us continue on. All right, now we have a letter that's significantly later, but not late in the movement in the sense, but the last month of 1974. This is a letter to one of his GBCs. This is not an original GBC in Southern California. This fellow became a psychotropic sahajiya in the late 70s. He then deserted the fabricated so-called ISKCON, but not for pure motives. And he eventually was dismembered in a head shop in England by one of his followers, after previous to that having cut off the fingers of a former follower and throwing him into a lake to die. So here we see this before he has done these abominable things. This letter is written to this GBC. But the difficulty is that our GBC men are falling victim to Maya. Today I trust this GBC, and tomorrow he will fall down. That is the difficulty. If the GBC men are so flickering, then what to speak of the others? Unless this problem is solved, whatever we may resolve, it will not be very useful. That's pretty heavy. In other words, whatever we may resolve refers to GBC meetings where there's resolutions, as if resolutions in and of themselves solve anything. Resolution, resolution, but no solution. But he says here, the GBC men are falling victim to Maya. This is the last month of 1974. Remember when we began this provisionality discussion, the first letter was September 1970, a few months after the GBC was formed. If the GBC remains strong, then there's nothing to worry about. Well, here we can see that there was plenty to worry about. And 1974 was a threshold year in regard to deviations, but to go into that right now will be a bit of a tangent. If the GBC men are so flickering, he can trust them at one moment supposedly, but then it proves that they're not reliable. They're not trustworthy. Even some of the big impersonalists understand the importance of reliability. But his GBC men, he's stating here, they fall victim to Maya at any moment. And as we read in that excerpt from the personal attendant, August of 1974, just a few months before this letter, he says 80% are falling down. So he says, unless that problem is solved, it doesn't matter what your resolutions are. You aren't going to improve the movement unless you can improve the leaders of the movement. And they're not in good shape. Let's read it again. But the difficulty is that our GBC men are falling victim to Maya. Today I trust this GBC, and tomorrow he will fall down. That is the difficulty. What is the difficulty? That is the difficulty. The misleaders constantly set bad standards, And therefore, those who follow them were not following genuine spiritual persons engaged in integral consciousness. If the GBC men are so flickering, then what to speak of the others? Unless this problem is solved, whatever we may resolve, it will not be very useful. Then there's another provision here in this very same letter, where he says, if the GBC men can ever manage properly, then I shall get some time for writing my books. Now, as many or perhaps most of you know, His Divine Grace formed the GBC because his movement was expanding in numbers. So in the beginning, he took care of all his devotees on an individual basis because he only had a temple in New York, San Francisco, Montreal. But then it expanded so much, so he created a GBC besides his temple presidents to help the temple presidents and to set the perfect example, the ideal example for the temple presidents, so they remained strong. And just in case a temple president deviated, so the GBC could come in and put another temple president in there, as long as there was unanimous agreement amongst all the GBCs, and as long as the devotees in the temple agreed. So, the provisions were simply not being met. He was not being freed from the headaches of management, which the GBC was created in order to free him from all these management responsibilities. But it was turning out to do the exact opposite. Then he says to one of his publication editors, you say that it is now my 79th birthday, but it is my 80th birthday. Big GBC man, so many editors, and it is not detected. You are all mudhas, what can I do? Do you know what mudha means? He's calling, he says, big GBC man, so many editors. One of the GBC articles says 79th birthday. Doesn't even know it's his 80th birthday. You are all mudhas. What can I do? Finally, this is to a governing body commissioner in May of 1976. It appears that because you have made some derogatory racial remarks against him in the presence of other devotees here in the temple, it has become difficult to manage and win the respect of these devotees. If the GBC undermines the efforts of the temple presidents, how will things go on smoothly? Well, frankly, they didn't go on very smoothly, did they? So again, if the GBC undermines, it's a warning. Well, the provisional warning was met, and the outcome that it foretold also came to pass. Tattvamasi. To change the envious thinking of people is no small task, and this truth especially applies to devotional cult leaders. As we just read in one of Prabhupada's letters, even a little impurity would deteriorate his movement and send the whole thing to hell. Since he has disappeared, there has been far more than just a little impurity manifested in it. As of the late 70s and early 80s, and of course continuing onwards, the GBC did not remain strong. The cataclysmic deviation of March 1978 alone proves that, but that's not the only evidence. We see in that August of 1974 excerpt from one of his personal attendants that Prabhupada revealed to him that 80% of his leaders were not following his rules and regulations given to them. To think that it has remained merely at 80% since that time is to be engaged in wishful thinking. The fact of the matter is that while his movement was still operating, his leaders deteriorated themselves, degraded, and became bad association not only for each other, but also for the many adoring workers who worship them. Free will is what it is. At a certain point, there was nothing that Prabhupada could do. He saw the pricks of Maya. He knew his leaders were falling down, but because they were envious of him and wanted to imitate him, and that was certainly proven in 1978, he was powerless to check their devolution. The GBC was supposed to free him from management so that he could write his books, but it wound up doing the exact opposite. As a result, we have to admit that this governing body commission has now been proven to be a failed experiment, and as a result of that, we now have the black hole known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, which every year sucks many innocent transcendentalists into its web, never to return. And in that letter to his editor, where he said, all big GBC men, you are all mudhas. Mudha is a very derogatory term. That he called his GBC men mudhas, that should tell us something. In the spring of 1978, 11 of his ultra-aggressive, ultra-proud GBC men bamboozled the rest of the members on the body and took over the movement as pretender Mahabhagavats ruling over zonal Acharya fiefdoms. You simply don't come back from that. His divine grace gave numerous provisional warnings, and we now see that all the dire outcomes predicted from those warnings have fructified. The time has come for every disciple of Srila Prabhupada, whether initiated or merely a follower, to recognize and confront this unfortunate fact, and in terms of your personal adhikar, to write, to speak, and to act accordingly. Sadeva Saumya